Hey everyone, before we get into the subject of today's video, which is the first in the new series of Through the Ages on the Ranger class, I just want to take a moment to thank everyone who voted on the different polls that I had, not only for the subject of the next Through the Ages series of videos, but also for the format in which it should take shape. I've decided to do something a little bit different with this one. Initially, I've always grouped similar editions together for the purposes of, I guess, cohesion, but it does tend to create some pretty long videos. Like with the Bard series, for example, most of the videos were 33 minutes to well over an hour. So I kind of want to cut that down. So for this series, I'm actually going to present each separate edition as its own video, but where I have some alternate features or some new class options for the various classes, I'm going to start incorporating them into the editions video, which I think you'll see a little bit later here. It's going to eliminate the need for like bonus videos, and it just, I think, will overall hopefully be a little bit better. I'm also going to separate each of these into their own distinctive playlist, a master list of just Through the Ages, as well as having each class have its own separate playlist as well. So if there's a class in particular that you want to really see, instead of having to go through the full playlist for the series, you can just look at the individual class ones. So that's something I hope to do here with this series as well. Anyway, with that out of the way, I want to thank everyone again for your support, for your enthusiasm for this, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. So without further ado, let's take a look at the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Ranger class. Hello YouTube, Dave here again. Welcome to the first installment in the Through the Ages series for the Ranger. So this is a series where we take a look at an aspect of the D&D game and see how it's evolved from its earliest version through the various releases of the Dungeons & Dragons game. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Ranger class, as I said, and it's going to be the first edition AD&D Ranger. Now this is a very interesting version of the class, and if you're someone who's newer to the D&D game, when I start talking about the abilities that this Ranger class has, you might be a little bit surprised considering the way that they are in the more modern versions of the game. Now, one thing with the first edition AD&D is things are kind of scattered all around. We're going to be focusing on just the Ranger section of the player's handbook, the actual class description, but there are a few other details that you have to look for in other parts of the book. For example, the Ranger class is actually racially restricted, which a lot of classes were back in the earlier versions of Dungeons & Dragons. So for example, the only two races that can be a Ranger class are the human, which could be any class, and the half-elf, which is by virtue of the fact that they are half human. So in first edition AD&D, an elven ranger did not exist. It was a human or half-elf only class. In addition, they have their weapon and armor proficiencies, which are not listed with the actual class description, but in various sections of the book. Again, first edition is kind of difficult to go through. So in the very beginning of the player character class section, it does state that the Rangers can use any weapon, as well as they're proficient in shields and any suit of armor, meaning that they can wear leather armor, they can wear plate armor. So they're proficient in all armors, all shields, and all weapons. Or they can choose all weapons, because the Ranger class starts with 3 weapon proficiencies that they choose the specific weapon that they can be proficient in. They can choose from any weapon in the book, though, so they're not limited like, say, a mage would, or a magic user would, I guess I should say, or a cleric would. So they can choose any weapon, but they have to choose which 3 weapons they start being trained in. And then every 3 levels after level 1, so level 4, level 7, level 10, etc., they get to add an additional weapon to the list of weapons that they're actually trained in. So that's some stuff to keep in mind here, but we're going to go to the actual Ranger class description, which can be found on page 24 of the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. Now, Rangers are a subclass of fighter who are adept at woodcraft, tracking, scouting, and infiltration and spying. All Rangers must be of a good alignment, although they can be lawful, chaotic, or neutral. A Ranger must also have a strength of 13, an intelligence of 13, and a wisdom and constitution of 14 or greater in order for you to actually qualify for the class. Something that if you're doing the 3d6 and you're generating the stats in the order that they're listed on the character sheet, can actually be a somewhat difficult proposition to do. So it's a bit harder to qualify than just a regular fighter, for example, where all that you need is a minimum of a 9 strength, which is a lot easier to do on 3d6 than 13s and 14s. Now, if the Ranger has ability scores of greater than 15 and strength, intelligence, and wisdom, they gain the benefit of adding 10% experience points whenever experience is awarded. It says here by the referee, but it's by the Dungeon Master. And in first edition, they kind of interchange those terms rather frequently. So it says greater than 15, which is a weird way of saying that they have to have a 16 or higher in order to get that 10% experience. And again, you have to have the 16 or higher in strength, intelligence, and wisdom. So it's a pretty powerful, it's pretty difficult for that 10% boost in your experience points. As far as hit dice are concerned, the Rangers are one of the few classes, I think there's only 2 classes in the Player's Handbook, but they are a class that actually starts with 2 hit dice at first level. The trade-off is that they are rolling d8s instead of a d10, like the fighter or the paladin would, paladin being another subclass of the fighter in first edition AD&D. So they're rolling a smaller die type, but they start with 2 hit dice instead of just 1. And if you have a hit point adjustment due to a high con, you add that to each hit dice. So if you're getting plus 2 hit points because of your constitution, at first level you're getting plus 4 hit points because you're adding 2 to each of the 2d8 that you're rolling. Also, the Ranger class gets up to 11 hit dice, which very few other classes actually manage to do. Most other classes stop gaining hit dice at 9th level or maybe 10th level. So the fact that they actually get up to 11 hit dice instead of 10 or 9, again, makes them a little bit more powerful than the average fighter or average class type would be. After they gain their 11th hit dice, every level thereafter, they simply gain a fixed amount of hit points. In this case, they gain an additional 2 hit points every level, and you no longer add your constitution modifier to those hit points because you're adding that con modifier when you gain a hit die, not just bonus hit points. So again, in older editions of D&D, you stopped rolling hit points at a certain point, and then you just gain a fixed total from that point. It's a little bit different, again, because you don't gain levels nearly as quickly in the older versions as you do in the newer ones. So it could take sometimes up to a year before you gained another single level for your class, if you even decided to continue playing once you stopped at the level where you gained those hit points. So again, very interesting way that the class was handled. Now, it says here, unlike other fighter types, as we mentioned, they gain 2 d8s for their hit dice. Also, when fighting humanoid-type creatures of the giant class, so giant class is the operative term there, you get to add an additional point of damage equal to the ranger's level. So a 5th level ranger attacking a giant class humanoid creature would get to add 5 points of damage. At 10th level, they would add 10, so on and so forth. As far as what creatures are considered to be the giant class, it includes the following list: bugbears, ettins, giants, gnolls, goblins, hobgoblins, kobolds, ogres, ogre magi, orcs, and trolls. So a pretty exhaustive list there, and it's, again, interesting to think of with today's sensibilities that a goblin or a kobold is considered to be part of the family, like the giant class of monsters, but that's just the way that it is. Rangers can also surprise their opponents 50% of the time. So in first edition AD&D, at the beginning of combat, you would roll for surprise. unless certain circumstances basically made it impossible to surprise one side or the other. But normally you would roll for surprise. You'd roll a d6, and typically on a roll of a natural 1 on the d6, you would surprise your opponents. The ranger can surprise their opponents by rolling a 1, 2, or 3 on the d6, which is, pretty good. That goes towards like the infiltration and like the scouting and spying aspect of the class. Also, they can track creatures outdoors and underground. To track creatures underground, they must observe them for at least 3 minutes, and they have to begin from where they observed that creature to have moved through or out of. So they have to actually know that the creature that they're trying to track was at the location that they're starting. They can't just pick up their tracks by searching a wide area. They have to know specifically where it was, and their chance to track depends on how the creature moves. If it goes through multiple rooms, or if other creatures sort of cross its path, or if it goes through a secret door, it can affect your chance of succeeding. Tracking outdoors is a lot easier because you have a 90% chance of success, and then it gets modified based off of, again, different factors like how much time's gone by, again, if other things have obscured the path, or if there's multiple things moving all in the same direction, it can make things a little bit easier for you as well. So outdoor tracking is a lot easier for the ranger. At 8th level, the ranger gains limited druidic spell ability, and they gain additional spells all the way through 17th level. So from levels 8 to 17, they get to add druid spells. We'll take a look at that chart in a moment. At 9th level, rangers gain limited magic user spell ability. As with the druidic spell ability, rangers cannot read druid or magic user spells from magic scrolls in any event. So we actually have the chart here. So rangers at 8th level gain 1 druidic spell, and at 9th level they gain 1 magic user spell. For druid spells, they get up to a 3rd level spell slot, starting at 16th level, and two 3rd level spell slots at 17th level. The magic user only gets up to a 2nd level spell slot starting at 13th level, but they do get up to 2 of those. Now again, it's interesting because classes like the paladin and the ranger didn't have their own spell lists like we kind of are familiar with them having, again, in the more modern versions of the game. But it also means that you can get some very interesting combinations of spells. For example, with the magic user spells, some 2nd level spells that the ranger could use are things like invisibility, stinking cloud. They can use the strength spell to give them like a much higher strength for attacking. 1st level, they can throw, if they wanted to, a magic missile, which is, again, kind of interesting to think about, seeing a ranger use magic missile, and of course they get up to the 3rd level druid spell. So it's interesting that they have the 2 different lists that they get to choose from. At 10th level, ranger lords are able to employ any non-written magic items which pertain to clairaudience, clairvoyance, ESP, and telepathy. Also at 10th level, they attract a body of 2 to 24, so 2d12 followers. Note that these henchmen, once lost, can never be replaced. So unlike other classes, when you gain these henchmen, if they die, you can eventually, get new ones, attract new ones. The rangers can never do that. Once they go through their followers, they're gone. They can employ mercenaries. Mercenaries can be hired, of course, and the followers are determined by the DM, who then informs what the types are once the Dungeon Master decides on them. The following restrictions apply to rangers. So those were sort of the benefits that they get, but there are some drawbacks. Any change to a non-good alignment immediately strips the ranger of all benefits, and the character becomes a fighter with 8-sided hit dice ever after and can never regain ranger status. So alignment was serious business back in the day. If you changed your alignment, it screwed over your class for pretty much forever. Some classes could atone, like I think the paladin had the ability to, but the ranger, if you go from good to even neutral, you lose everything. The +1 damage per level against the giant class monsters is gone. The ability to surprise is gone. The ability to track, all of that stuff disappears, and you only gain d8s for hit dice for any level which you could gain hit dice thereafter, and you're limited by the fighter chart instead of the ranger one. So fighters, for example, I think they stop gaining hit dice at 9, so you don't get the 10th or 11th d8 if you haven't already as a fallen ranger. So again, alignment restriction was a serious thing back in the day, and changing your alignment was never something to be taken lightly. Rangers may also not hire men-at-arms, servants, aides, or henchmen until they're at least 8th level or higher. No more than 3 rangers can ever operate together at any time. So if you want to have a 4-player group where everybody's a ranger, technically the rules say that that's not allowed. Rangers may only own those goods and treasure which they can carry on their person and or place on their mount. Any excess has to be donated to a worthy communal or institutional cause, and it says here in brackets, it can never be given to another player character. So collecting treasure, it's really limited to what you can conceivably have on your person or on your mount. Everything else doesn't mean anything to the ranger, and it all has to be given away. So that was the description of the Ranger class for first edition AD&D, and it's definitely a very interesting version of this class compared to what we will see in later editions. The D8 for hit dice does sound a bit detrimental at first, considering that they are a fighter class and the other fighter classes get the D10s, but the fact that you start with 2, I know is something that was very attractive for people back in the day. And the fact that when you think about modern Rangers and you can compare them to the version of the Ranger that we have here in first edition, there's a huge amount of differences. First of all, the fact that Rangers can use any armor is something that just does not exist in this current version or even for several editions past. Rangers are typically reduced to like light and maybe medium armors, but typically only light armors, and there's penalties for them if they use anything other than that. But here in first edition AD&D, you can have a ranger wearing plate armor. It actually reminds me of watching like the Lord of the Rings movies and seeing Aragorn being a ranger, being specifically referred to as a ranger on a number of occasions, and seeing him wearing metal armor at the end of the end of Return of the King, I should say, it's like, okay, so he is a first edition ranger because they could do that back then. So it's really interesting to sort of see how that is definitely going to change as we go through the progression here. Also, there's no 2-weapon fighting, which is something that you typically associate with the Ranger class, nor is there really any focus on ranged attacks. So them not being like skilled archers or overly skilled archers or specializing in archery like we see again in the more modern versions of D&D is definitely a big change. So it is a powerful class, but it is a harder class to qualify for, again, considering that the default way of generating your characters was to assign your stats in the order that you rolled them, and needing 13s and 14s as your prerequisites spread across 4 of the 6 attributes was definitely a much more difficult thing to accomplish back then. So it is a powerful class, but the fact that it's more difficult to qualify for is sort of one of the trade-offs, one of the justifications for it being that powerful, and the fact that you have to be very careful with how you act in the game world, because the alignment change was a very serious thing back then, and you can lose it all and never be able to get it back. So again, a very interesting take on the first edition Ranger. And let's talk about that giant ability where they get to add their level. Again, that's really good compared to what we'll see much later on. But that's not all, because this is the base version of the class. This is the version of the class that was introduced in the player's handbook. However, there were some modifications made to the Ranger class later on in first edition AD&D through a book that I do happen to own. So we're going to take a look at that next. Unearthed Arcana, perhaps the most polarizing early book from the D&D library. I know just as many people who love this book as I know people that hated this book. But it did present some very interesting changes to some of the base classes that we had in the player's handbook, as well as introducing a whole slew of new classes, one of which I already covered as the Barbarian. So cool stuff there. We're not here to talk about the Barbarian though. We're here to talk about the Ranger. Now, with Unearthed Arcana, if you're using this book in your first edition AD&D games, the modifications made to the Ranger are meant to replace the abilities that were described, similar abilities that were described in the player's handbook, or to augment them. And we're going to see that here very shortly. So we're going to go to, I think it's page 21. Yeah, 21 is where the Ranger class starts. Now, the first whole section here is focused on the Ranger's tracking ability. I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but just as a quick refresher from the player's handbook, Rangers can track creatures both outdoors as well as underground or indoors. And if they're tracking indoors, they have a base percentage chance to track depending on certain factors. And they have to observe the creature for at least 3 minutes, and they have to start tracking it from a point on the ground that they witnessed the creature standing. Now, as we'll see here, like I said, there have been some changes made to that. And then for outdoor tracking, the Ranger in the player's handbook had a 90% base chance of success. So the biggest change to tracking from the Unearthed Arcana book is that now the Ranger's percentage chances to successfully track scale with their level. It starts at a base rate of 10% plus an additional 10% per Ranger level. So at first level, a Ranger has a 20% chance to successfully track a creature. At second level, they would have a 30% chance, and so on and so forth. Now, different factors can influence or increase or decrease their percent chance for succeeding. For example, if the ground was soft enough to basically make a really good impression of the footprint, it gives you, and it says here, an extra 20% chance to successfully track them. So at first level, following a really solid looking footprint track through a soft surface gives you a 40% base chance. If there are obvious signs of them going through an area, such as markings or other such things, it adds an extra 10%. If there were multiple creatures sort of all moving through the same, of the same type, moving in the same direction, of course, that also increases it. There's a lot of things that can do it, and there's things that can also detract from it, such as other creatures, different creatures walking through and disrupting the tracks. That can decrease the chances. So this whole first section here is really just focusing on the tracking. And I'm not going to go into all the details because it's just a lot of like, this increases, this decreases. So we're not really going to get into that. But in addition to their percent chances increasing with level, and that works the same, it's the same percent chances for indoor or outdoor with this newer version. As they progress through levels, they also can learn more information as they're tracking. For example, they can identify common creatures, or they can find tracks, starting with a random point with wider and wider radiuses for them to find and identify the tracks, and so on and so forth. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all of it, but their ability to track, in addition to just the base percent increasing, their actual ability to learn information through tracking definitely increases as well. Again, if you look at Lord of the Rings, look at Aragorn, when he was following the tracks of Merry and Pippin, he was definitely a high-level ranger that was gaining a ton of information. The list of humanoid giant class enemies has also been expanded because the player's handbook only had monsters from the original monster manual. By the time this book came out, you had a Monster Manual 2 and the Fiend Folio had been out. So they increased the list of monsters to include the following: bugbears, cyclopskin, dunestalkers, ettins, flins, which is a type of gnoll, giants, gibberlings, gnolls, goblins, grimlocks, hobgoblins, kobolds, measles, norker, ogre, ogre mage, orgalon, orc, Quagoth, a Soli, I don't know what that is, to be honest, a troll, and a Zavart. So this basically just increases the options because more books have come out. And I gotta be honest, I know DMs from my earlier days playing second edition that if they were running first edition and this book wasn't out yet, they would absolutely take those monsters from the Monster Manual 2 and the Fiend Folio and use them almost exclusively because they didn't want you to get the benefit of that +1 damage per level of Ranger class against the Giant class enemy. So I know a few people that would never use a Goblin, an Orc, or a Kobold, or regular Ogre ever again, and would instead try to find equivalents from other books. So, I'm kind of glad that they increased the list there. Now, also, we've got weapon proficiency requirements here. So, as I mentioned before, the Ranger class can use any weapon, but they only gain a limited number of proficiency slots at first level to choose which weapons from any in the list that they can actually utilize. Now, with this class, or with this version of it, they actually have requirements that they need to meet in order to actually gain their proficiencies. So, I mentioned before that in the first edition Player's Handbook, the Rangers didn't really have any particular focus on ranged attacks. That has changed because of the Rangers' 3 initial weapons of proficiency. I don't know why they call it that. They should just call it weapon proficiencies. But of their first 3 initial weapons of proficiency, one must be either a bow of any sort or a light crossbow. However, the Ranger cannot have both a bow and a light crossbow as weapons of proficiency until obtaining 7th level. So remember, they gain their first new weapon proficiency at 4th level, and then at 7th level, and so on. When the weapon type not already taken can be counted as a 5th weapon proficiency. By the time a Ranger gains a 4th weapon proficiency at 4th level, the character's list of weapons must include, so either a bow or a light crossbow, a dagger or a knife, a spear or an axe, and a sword. So those have to be your 4 weapon proficiencies. So you are a bit more, even though you can choose technically any weapon in the game, the first few sets of proficiencies are ones that are a bit more restricted, which I guess works as sort of a drawback compared to just the regular fighter, which can choose any weapon. Additionally, once they reach 4th level, or after 4th level, the Ranger can use one of their new weapon proficiencies to become specialized in a single weapon. So, this book introduces weapon specialization, where you get to put a second proficiency slot onto a weapon you're already proficient in. And then you get to add +1 to hit and +2 to damage. So the Ranger, normally fighters are the only class that can do that, and we'll see that in later editions of D&D. But in first edition, using the Unearthed Arcana book, the Ranger can become specialized in a weapon, unlike other editions where that's not an option for them. So it's interesting the way that that's sort of been modified. So those are sort of the changes and the updates to the Ranger class, and overall, this is a really cool class. I love the Ranger class. It's still strange that they can wear plate armor and they can throw a magic missile spell around, but it is still a really, really cool class. I will say I like the changes implemented in Unearthed Arcana, and I would absolutely be utilizing that if I were to run first edition AD&D again. I like the way that they changed the tracking to make it so that the Ranger doesn't just start as an expert tracker at first level. It never really gets better at it as they go. It's just sort of like always the same static percentages, just modified by certain conditions. Here you still have conditions modifying things, but the more levels the Ranger has, the better that they are tracking, and I think that's just a better way of handling it. The weapon proficiencies, like I said, I like the fact that they're a bit more restrictive with what you have to choose for those first few proficiency slots that you're given. After that, you can sort of go nuts and choose whatever you want, and again, it makes for a great check and balance with the fighter class. So the fighter has wider options, but less powerful abilities overall when compared to the Ranger class. So yeah, there we go, the first edition AD&D Ranger. Now let me know in the comments below, did you ever play a Ranger back in the day? Did you ever want to play a Ranger but couldn't because you didn't roll the necessary stats to qualify for the class? And yeah, just let me know what your memories of the first edition AD&D Ranger were, if you have any of them, either yourself as a player, as who's played one, or as a player that had a Ranger in the group, or even as a dungeon master that had players playing Rangers back in the day. I look forward to hearing your guys' awesome stories. So yeah, it's a great class. It's my favorite class, and it's very interesting to see how powerful it kind of was in first edition, and just how far from grace the class can fall when we start looking at some of the newer versions of the Dungeons and Dragons and even the AD&D role-playing game. So thank you guys very much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you check out the next installment, where we're going to take a look at the second edition AD&D Ranger class. I can't wait. Until then, take care.